Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to our webinar today. My name is Cheryl Cluzio, and I am the Vice President of Marketing here at Online Business Systems. And on behalf of the team at Online and our presenters today, we just want to officially extend a warm welcome to our presentation entitled Solve Your SecOps Gaps. You know, I am really looking forward to today's session because I know that it is going to be full of very practical ways that your organizations can bring your security and operations teams together so that they can collectively and collaboratively manage risks, and vulnerabilities, and all while doing this in the really unique time that we've been living in, and in the post-COVID-19 space as well. We have two onliners leading our discussion today, so I want to extend a welcome to them as well. Joining us, we have Daryl Popowich, who is our Managing Director of Service Management, and Rick Hullid, who is Online's Director of Security Strategy. And I don't know if you've had the opportunity to meet either of these fine onliners, but I can tell you that they are both very committed to working closely with clients and come at it from a practical perspective, looking for ways to help our clients reshape or improve their security operations so that they can be as efficient and as aligned to business objectives as possible. Rick is a leader in our risk, security, and privacy practice, and he is particularly focused on helping companies move the needle, if you will, on their security posture, changing and transforming their security and risk position from where they are today to where they want to be in the future. And as the recent VP of IT at H&R Block Canada, Daryl brings a real overarching perspective on service management and the discipline of service management, both to online, but even more importantly to our client community. So, you know, all that to say, I think we've got the right people presenting on the topic of SecOps today. Before we get started, there's just a couple of quick little housekeeping items I wanted to go through. If you've joined one of our sessions before, you'll note that we will be running a live Q&A at the end of the webinar. So you will see that we've enabled our chat feature. You'll find that on the right-hand side of your screen, that little auditorium panel. So if at any point during the presentation you have any questions, please just pop them in there, and we'll make sure to capture them and share them during the Q&A portion at the end of our session. And of course, please don't be concerned if you miss anything or you're trying to take notes as Daryl and Rick are chatting. I will make sure that you receive a copy of the webinar recording once we've wrapped up later today as well. So I think that's it for me. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Daryl and Rick.
Thank you, Cheryl. It's Daryl here. I'd like to echo my thanks to everyone who's joined today and send my wishes for safety of yourself, your family, and your friends through this time. And really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us and learn a little bit about our thoughts of the SecOps gap and how we can move forward. Before we do that, I would like to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about online. So it's 33 years and older, over 350 professionals across North America, led by our visionary leader, Chuck Lowen, who believes people are the foundation for great success. And that is a testament with the measures and metrics that we are very proud of. 14 consecutive years in the best workplaces, an NPS with our clients way ahead of the industry average, and some stellar outcomes from Glassdoor, both as a company and to our leader. But what is it that we do? I like using Simon Sinek's start with why. We provide a unique and refreshing client experience. And that's something we talk about on a daily basis. It's interesting how often we bring that up when we're talking about strategies and how we deliver excellence. How? We help companies with their secure digital transformation. And when you come back to that refreshing experience, now we can talk about the what we do. So over on the digital transformation, in my opinion, we start with the customer experience and focus on what excellence looks like and how that matches up in a digital business transformation. We help organizations connect their delivery and their people to customers. And when needed, we dive in and do product development in their digital workplaces, whether it's client facing or whether it's employee facing. And then service management, how the supporting processes within an organization drive and push the transformation in those digital products out to the customer experience. And on the cybersecurity side, I'll ask Rick to speak to what it is that we do for clients.
Yes, thank you, Daryl. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're at. Our cybersecurity practice really has 4 specific services within it, but they are interrelated. And I'll start maybe top down. So our advisory services is I would call more the executive level consulting type services, virtual CISO services, and those types of services that are within that particular service group. And then on the top right-hand corner, leading into our assessment services, this is where we would do risk-based assessments, compliance-based consulting and such. And then I'll slide over to the left where our technical security services group is. So these are the folks that would focus on penetration testing, secured code reviews, etc. And then over to the bottom right is our managed security services group. So this is an actual security operations team that would do your traditional threat monitoring, vulnerability assessments, those sorts of things.
Thanks, Rick. So just a little bit about Online as a company, what we do, but starting with why, delivering that excellent customer experience. And so why we are here today, I'm going to turn it over to Rick to speak to what the difference between traditional IT and security has felt like in the industry for the past number of years. Rick?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll speak to it from maybe a little bit from a historical view, having been in the industries for over 30 years now. So my argument would be is, for those that have been in the IT industry, going back 20 plus years, security was not front and center. It was often, an afterthought, bolted on later. It certainly wasn't mainstream. Not until probably about 15 years ago when, some of the primary organizations, the US Department of Defense, organizations like NIST, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, ISO over in Europe, other organizations kind of right around, 2003, 2004, they really started to put more focus and energy into this whole security thing, especially as the internet became what it is or what it was and what it was going to become. So on the left-hand side, I like the analogy to think that on the security side or the risk side, we're extremely proactive. Our jobs is around security clearly and making sure we address risk as we can in a proactive fashion. The right-hand side of this diagram is intended to represent, IT. IT is has gone blazing a trail of its own. And in a part of the discussion today is around, while they're both related, they're certainly cousins for sure, and there needs to be tight collaboration and tight alignment. Often within organizations, there has been a divergence. And so we're looking to do a little bit of convergence through this discussion.
Thanks, Rick. And and I really do think that visual of IT being the bullet train and the fighter jet going on the offensive and or defensive and defending the train is really resonates with me anyhow. So today, talking about that SecOps gap, let's look at what we're going to cover. We're going to review the 2 roles and how they differ. Between those 2 roles, we'll then take a look at what we feel are natural SecOps gaps. And then we'll dive into the practical piece of taking a look at some first actions that we feel can move forward to help organizations with their security and operations teams, and then areas where automation can certainly help. And lastly, we'll look at where we do believe organizations need to be moving, and that's going on the offensive and begin threat hunting. We'll talk about that. So to start off, I'll turn it over to Rick to review what the security role in an organization is focused on.
Yeah, thank you, Daryl. So maybe just to level set and set a little bit of context for everyone on the call is every organization is different. So the context of this is around perhaps a little larger organization with a level of maturity that may or may not have a chief security officer role, or at minimums a leader within the organization that is focused on risk and security. So the reason I just want to level set is that we have seen over the years, right, that especially with the mid to small size organizations, where there just isn't the ability to have a completely capable security arm. What we often see is more of a converged role where one person or a group of folks have both security responsibilities and traditional IT responsibilities. So kind of keep that in mind as we go through the discussion today. So I'll summarize this in a few points to suggest that, from a security leadership perspective, I care about making sure or trying to secure the organization. We'll talk about assets, and assets mean something different to different folks depending upon where you're coming from. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I'll just broaden it to say that, security, we care about securing assets and business systems. And we also want to make sure that the business is aware of the risks that are persistent or relevant or potential for the organization. So real quickly, I'll touch on these points. So in terms of information security capability, so this is effectively building out the team, making sure you've got the team that can actually perform the security requirements or the security functions. The next thing that's really important, it certainly has grown over the last number of years, is around making sure you understand kind of what the internal and external influences are, regulatory, compliance, standards, etc. So I suspect most folks are familiar with things like PCI. There's lots of different industry or government regulations and such that you need to account for because you're going to be held accountable for meeting those needs. So it's really a big part of the job at this point. The next two, I'll kind of collapse down the next two bullets in terms of we want to make sure we can understand and assess the different threats and vulnerabilities, all under the banner of identifying and managing risk. Okay. Related to that, clearly there's lots of security related processes. The one that's the most common would be around incident management or security incident management, to be specific. The next one is around security controls or security services, if you prefer. With these standards and kind of this whole domain, the security domain, there are a lot of security controls that should and could be implemented within an organization. It's also key to know, right, that this is not just about technology. There's lots of controls on the people and process side. So that does imply a level of maturity and a level of formality with the organizations that is often forgot because everyone, frankly, is just so busy. The second to last is around just basically security awareness and training. So often this organization would lead up the program that's required for that. And then related to the regulatory and the compliance one is just being prepared for the assessments and audits. Depending on your industry, you could be in situations where you need to do it quarterly. You need to do it at minimally annually. So it's a program of activities that need to occur with an organization. No longer is it just an ad hoc once every 5 years if someone requests it be done. So thank you. I'll definitely touch on more of this in the next few slides. Back to you, Daryl.
Great, thanks, Rick. So looking from the lens of the operational side, and as Rick pointed out, many times and often we see that security and operations are in the same group. They're the same people, the same person, but they are different views. And you can see that manifest itself a number of times throughout the day, throughout the week, as organizations are trying to implement new infrastructure, new capabilities, new applications, as they're trying to make their employees work better, faster. Think of that bullet train. The train started out not as a bullet train in its first inceptions, yet it was stable, it was safe, and it was innovative. It was a very reliable means to move people and things across the country. And that's really the focus of IT. As the former VP of H&R Canada, I lived this in certain periods. For personal income tax, that organization had a period of time of just 2 months where it collected over 85% of its revenue. And so you can imagine the operational nightmare and the operational urgency when there were bumpy patches in that train, or in worst cases, derailment or outages that could be driving $2 million of lost revenue an hour out of the organization. All of a sudden, there are experts everywhere trying to help. And so keeping the business productive and competitive is that view, making sure that everything is running, and so customers can be serviced, employees can do their job, and part of that is making sure that there are controls and testing around everything that is done, but as well as driving innovation along those well-worn paths, along that train railway, so that we can even go faster and better and more successfully. And so it's a competing view that pushes against sometimes the security focus. And when you have those competing views, there's some conflict. And most of the time it's healthy. Move fast is not necessarily always secure and safe. And what we have identified and what we're calling that, when that creative conflict gets too big and you actually have these two views in opposition as opposed to working in concert, that's the SecOps gap. When we have a gap anywhere between two people or two organizations, the best way to start closing that gap is to come up with and start working from a common language and a common framework. And so we think that the best way to do that is to bring in the NIST framework. It's simple and it speaks to both sides and come in to bridge the gap. And so now that we've looked at these two roles, what we want to do is spend a little bit of time identifying and listing off a few areas where we really see some natural gaps between the organizations. And Rick's going to start from the security side, speaking to what security does and what they're looking for from the IT organization. Rick?
Yes, so as you can kind of see in the security box there, those are just some of the key types of functions or services that typically fall within the security domain. I touched on those earlier. So maybe let's just go to the next point here, Daryl, and I'll speak to some specifics. So as Daryl mentioned, we're using NIST, the Cybersecurity Framework, or CSF, for the basis of this discussion. The reality is that there are many different industry or government or think tank like standards and frameworks that could be used in its place. So that's the reality. The other reality is that there's so much overlap and commonality amongst them that this is a very good one that actually is a good roll-up. It's very easy to consume, regardless of whether you're on the security side, the IT side, or the business side, because it's got 5 key kind of functions within it. Clearly, there's lots and lots of details that underpin it, but it's a good overview of that. So what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes is really some of the key things that that I have basically experienced. I've worked, frankly, across IT and security for a number of years now, and as I mentioned earlier, that there is no one size fits all, and there is no one organization that's exactly the same as the next. But what I'm going to kind of touch on are 7 different areas that line up to the NIST framework that I think are pretty common in terms of being functional groups that security has a dependency or a reliance on. Maybe the key message here, right, is that the security organization or the security team, it shouldn't be treated as a silo. There's no way a security team that has a risk component related to their function can be successful in isolation. There is a heavy reliance on the IT and business. So I'll touch on these 7 real quickly. So the first one is around asset management, right? So to broaden that, effectively think this is about hardware and software and business assets, depending upon kind of your definition of what that is. But it's really to make sure that the security organization understands the business. If the security organization can't understand the business, the security organization cannot play a sufficient role in terms of determining risk. That's the bottom line for that one. The next one is around access controls. So access controls, broadly speaking, right, it's about everything that would include network segmentation, ACLs, access control list on different types of appliances or processes, multi-factor authentication, etc. It's really about making sure that the right folks have the right access to what they need. And so while security, again, has a dependency and we're putting forward standards and requirements to have that occur, it's largely the IT organization that needs to do the implementation and management of it. Okay. The third one, this is around secure configurations. So this is not new. We've been doing configurations for probably 50 plus years, but now there are some very specific standards and requirements around securing your configurations for, regardless if it's hardware, software, or network, or any underpinning infrastructure. So again, security is coming forward with best practice, but it's largely reliant on the IT organization to implement and manage. Okay, to the right, the next one is around security systems. You can think about this as being security controls or security services. This would include everything from the technical proxies that are put in place for email and web. It can include intrusion defense or prevention systems, data loss prevention. There's a whole gamut, right? There's literally 100 types of controls now that are out in this space. This is the one area where security may have some solutions or some systems that they actually manage and own themselves that may be considered black boxes for the IT organization, whereas others, such as email and things related to that, certainly are not security controls specifically. Okay. The next one is around network, basically network best practice. So this is kind of locking down your network and any sort of communication and transport side of it. So this would include things such as the different network services, the different protocols, ports, et cetera, et cetera. All again, best practice. Security has best practice and requirements, but effectively implemented by the IT organization, generally speaking. Okay. So I should have mentioned previously is that kind of if you can see the colors right from left to right, the blue where we started off with asset management, that lines up with the identify within the NIST framework. And then those purple shaded boxes are related to the protect domain. Now we're getting into the detect side of the framework. So effectively, this is around ensuring that the organization is logging any sort of traffic that may be of interest. And so as a part of the security function, which relates to the monitoring and auditing side, is to understand, right, do we understand the business? And by saying that, that means we understand how the business is actually operating and communicating. So digging deeper, this is around really getting down into the bits and bytes around what is being passed across the network. A communication that's originating within inside the organization that's actually trying to reach a host that's in Eastern Europe, in Asia. Those sorts of things should be of interest for sure. If your business has no reason to be doing that, those are yellow flags at minimum to raise awareness. So needless to say, all of that monitoring, largely speaking, all those sources of data that are required for the monitoring and logging side of it, IT-driven, IT-managed systems. So again, security is coming looking for requirements and then to work as a partner with IT for logging, monitoring, auditing. And then last, certainly not least, and this lines up with the respond function within the framework, this is around vulnerability management. So this is a huge problem for sure. Most everyone that I've worked with over the last X number of years would say that, yeah, it's hard for the IT organization to get the a report from the security guys that say, here's the 5,000 things we need you to fix, without any sort of context. So for the purposes of this, security is going to identify and try to contextualize the different vulnerabilities based on their understanding of the business. And clearly, right, there's the expectation that the information technology team and operations teams, they're the remediators. So in a roundabout way to say it is security is going to identify, but the organization, IT driven, is going to be the response team or the remediators. Over to you, Daryl.
Thanks, Rick. So I think some of you, depending on which role you're sitting in on the call, have already heard some of those situations where security is asking for things or coming into traditional IT, looking for a measure of maturity that necessarily may not be there. And I have seen that manifest itself in asset management, where we know what the assets are, information tech, we've implemented them, we've configured them, we've set them up to work, and we're managing and tracking them, and yet security is asking for a different view. And so we need to work closer with security to understand what they're looking for. We treat dev, test, and prod very differently. And sometimes the requests in security seem very generalized, and that can help create that gap between the two viewpoints. Access control, give us the standards before we let anyone build something. I'm sure everyone has had to deal with that one application that's business critical that's been sitting under somebody's desk that has user admin privileges. We can't get rid of the access without rebuilding, and it's just a constant pain within the organization in IT to continually try to figure out how to protect the organization, protect that application, but from a viewpoint of keeping it running, not necessarily from a security perspective. Same thing in secure configuration. Tell us what the configuration as we're building, tell us before we start building security so that we can configure it the first time as it goes out the door, not trying to redefine and rebuild the car that's on the track, that application that's in production. When you look at network best practices, it's the same idea. But we would ask, don't wait around for others to design security in mind when you're talking about security or network best practices. Get in front of the initiatives, and as opposed to coming in after and asking if we've done it right. These are some of the statements and phrases that can exist internally. And it's interesting how often we have seen that happen within the same person. Oh, I didn't have time to get to looking at the security. I just had to get that out the door. I had to get that through on the weekend. And we still end up with a missing security practice or a secure configuration. And the log and monitoring and auditing, we can keep logs of everything, but no one could afford it if we keep every single transaction. Same thing with monitoring. We'll get so many alerts that it overwhelms us and we don't know what we should be looking at and what we should be telling security, what we should be telling the business. So we start changing the thresholds. And again, changing the thresholds just so that we can get our job done through the day starts again pushing a gap. And I hope you can see and resonate with where that's occurred in your organizations. And then the remediate vulnerabilities. This is probably the easiest one to identify with. Patch Tuesday comes out, or the vulnerability scan comes in, and you now have 5,000 more or 10,000 or however many vulnerabilities you have to remediate, and there's a request for a plan to reduce all those vulnerabilities down. And there's that one server that we can't touch because it's got that application that has the user administration. And doesn't security know by now that we can't touch that thing and we've isolated it, and it still is showing up in the report? And that just can help create that gap even further. And so all of these things, it's the little transactions in a day-by-day basis that can get in the way of bridging the gap and getting these organizations and these viewpoints closer. And so we do think that there's one way to view to help always bring the conversation closer. I'll turn it over to Rick to talk about what that is. in risk?
Yeah, right. Is everybody should be thinking about risk. And in the context of this, everybody would include the business, IT, security, other organizations or functions within a company. So the reason we put forward these views, I would consider them just to be complementary. Depending on where you're at or where you've traveled within your careers, you've probably come across these or variations of these. So I'll generalize it because there's a couple key themes here that we want to play back to you. So from a risk component relationship, right, there's assets, there's threats, and there's vulnerabilities. And typically when there's assets that have vulnerabilities that have applicable threats, there's risk. So we want to make sure we can understand and identify that. More from a risk assessment practitioner perspective, I may actually want to calculate risk because it helps influence what's the most important things to work on. So for the next view, where we want to understand the threats that may be realized, and specifically we're looking for likelihood, probability, and if that threat was to occur against a particular asset, what does it mean? So gravity would imply business impact. The next part of that is understanding these threats that may try to expose vulnerabilities that may exist. We're really trying to assess the effectiveness of our controls or our safeguards, because ultimately the ineffectiveness is what the vulnerability actually represents. Okay, and then the last component is the assets. So again, and I talked about assets a little bit earlier, depending upon your definition of asset, for myself and others that kind of think more top down, an asset could be everything from a business driver, a business service, information itself is an asset. Whereas others actually would think about an asset as being something more tangible in terms of a server or a workstation or something a little bit more physical. But nonetheless, when you bake all those together and you do the math, then you're able to come up with your risk calculations and kind of your risk equation. You're able to actually then do a little bit more analysis on which areas, which controls should you focus on. If we address some specific controls that may actually help overall. So that's kind of why we want to provide a little bit of a risk calculation view. And then last but not least is kind of that information systems view. I'd like to include this view because for the folks that think about information systems as really being the heart of their company around information, typically there's 4 components within an information system. So people, process, technology are the common 3, but we often like to include data because honestly, data is at the heart of everything now. And so if you think about this as being an asset or one of the assets within an organization, then you apply the same logic around the threats that are trying to bang against vulnerabilities that are applicable to these assets. And again, in people, process, phishing and things of that nature are not technical vulnerabilities per se. Those are more people and process vulnerabilities. So nonetheless, so we try to instill safeguards in between those vulnerabilities and those threats, which are controls. So before we leave this slide, I just maybe want to play back a couple of key themes or key messages here, at least from the security side. Is as a security leader, I feel that the assets in the context of this discussion are largely owned by the business, with IT as the steward and or a custodian. From the security side, I'm largely a consumer, right? For me to do my job to secure the business, whatever the definition is that I need to understand the assets, whatever the definition of assets are. So that's kind of why we use assets, but we're largely consumers. The vulnerabilities is actually one where there's clearly a joint relationship, as we talked about previously, is where security is traditionally and historically, playing the role of identifying vulnerabilities and then having a tight collaboration with the IT and business organizations around these are vulnerabilities and here's what it potentially means, right? In the risk conversation. So we have the conversation, but looking for the IT organization and business to remediate those vulnerabilities. And then the last one is around threats, right? And this is where the security team plays a larger role with identifying threats to the different types of safeguards.
Thanks, Rick. And so now we want to shift over. We have that focused view of risk with assets, vulnerabilities, and threats. And we have those gaps. And now what can we do to start bridging the gap? Because when we get back to our day job, those same behaviors will persist and will still create that chasm between the organizations and between the outcomes. So let's look at some first actions and where automation can help and how you should be driving. So we have the risk. Keep that in mind as we start looking at what we can do next. So across each of these processes, and again, that's not all of them coming out of the NIST framework, but this is where we see the easily identifiable gaps. And so first step is to find your current state. Every organization has had to respond in various ways with the COVID, their individualized COVID response, and they've changed some of their remote workplace assets and infrastructure. They've changed a number of their client-facing applications, and they may or may not have a good grasp on exactly where they sit. So we need to get that baseline. You can't get to where you're going unless you know exactly where you are. And so we have 3 different starting points: asset discovery, client asset discovery, and cloud security. And so from the asset discovery side, what we know that every organization has their tool sets, whether it's Microsoft System Center Config Manager, PRTG, SQL, any kind of database managing, et cetera, et cetera. Bring all these different monitoring or asset configuration and management tools in, and we feel that they are point solutions to help those individuals manage the specific types of assets, and we don't have that complete picture. And so all of these components need to take a look and get that baseline. Find out what you have, and powered with our partner BMC, we can come in a short time frame. In a couple of weeks, we can get that first view of what your new current state looks like. All of your infrastructure assets, what the applications that are on them, and what they're talking to, and be able to gain a baseline. From a client asset discovery, I was on a call the other week with some CIOs in Calgary, where we're talking about what their organization had to do to create a remote workplace. And so they had come pick up your IT days, where employees could come in and they just pick up the computers and other infrastructure that they need to take home and set up their home office. About half of them talked about that. And then a good portion of those said that their CFO had already come and asked them, how many of these assets do I have to write off? How many workstations and laptops and iPads have left the organization forever? And that's now a drain on the business. And client asset discovery, go find out where everything that's connected to your corporate infrastructure, find out where it is, understand what that asset is, what's its current version, what's its current patch version, everything that you need to know, and get control back so that you can create a new plan for when you get back into the new working norm. In cloud security, those of you that have cloud infrastructure have very likely been able to utilize the elasticity of the cloud capabilities and expand your remote workplace environments to allow more employees to work, to expand your client-facing applications so that more clients can interact with you virtually. And so these 3 components, they're really quick, powered by BMC, come in, and in a matter of days or weeks, we give you that first view. And the most important component about these 3 is that it identifies what the others aren't configured for. The next step is to prioritize. Now that you have that first view, some of you already may have that view, but how do you prioritize what to work on next? And we think looking at the configuration of all of those hardware, software, network assets, and ensuring that they're compliant with your standards, whether it's PCI, HIPAA, ISO, CIS, anything that you need to compare against, how compliant are you and what changes do you have to work on? And again, now you can apply the context of that asset discovery against the application mapping. What is most important for your organization? What's your client-facing app, and are we configured correctly? And then you layer in the vulnerability. All of the vulnerabilities that exist out there, all the patches. Patch Tuesday in most organizations is dreaded and halts work. Well, what do you need to work on first? Again, if you have a number of dev environments, You don't need to go and resolve vulnerabilities if you're going to be turning them off in the near term. And so now you have a prioritized set of action, and you can start burning down the work that's the right work at the right time that's in front of you. And that can free up time, and you can start putting into your work plans the ability to automate. And two components here that we've had success is in patching automation and integrated change management. So at some clients, we've been able to complete implementing these services, these offerings, in order to get to the ability to reduce a 4-week patching effort of the team down to 4 minutes. And that frees the team up to focus on the new applications and the new infrastructure and look to the future and getting the right conversations around what the right risk profile is. And same thing with integrated change management. If you have people sitting there babysitting changes as they're moving into production, you're just not going to have that ability to look to the future and get ready to plan and implement your new working norm, COVID-19, or take a year or two out what the new marketplace demands are. Once you have all these, you can even start thinking about managed security monitoring. And this is in Rick's area. I'll let you speak quickly to managed security, Rick.
Yeah, so maybe just to summarize real quickly, right? Managed security, think about those as being those operational functions, such as threat monitoring. Effectively, think about folks that are in Operations Center, your security analyst types that are actively monitoring networks and different systems, applications, etc. The reason that we have this one called out separately is that what we have found and see is that a lot of organizations are challenged with building their security capabilities. And this would be an example of a security capability. So rather than invest internally with building out something that frankly is somewhat of a commodity service at this point, given there's a lot of service providers in this space now, that organizations look to perhaps outsource that.
Perfect. Thanks, Rick. So when we get this type of activity and we complete some of these components around those processes, we have seen success in organizations pulling their information technology and security groups closer together into something that we call converged. And Rick touched on it before. When we have this converged environment where what used to be two different views are now starting to mesh into one view, we can shift to going on the offensive. And Rick will walk you through what threat hunting means.
Yeah, perfect. So thank you for that, Daryl. Hopefully everyone is comfortable with what has led up to this. You know, one of the underpinning or overarching themes, right, is that from the security side of the organization, I want to play a role for sure with making sure the discover, prioritize, all of that side of it, and also, frankly, influencing what IT does in terms of automation, because if it impacts me from the risk side, then it impacts, and I have a stake in that discussion. So hopefully that all makes sense. The reason we wanted to kind of end this presentation with a little bit more on the threat side of it is because this, you know, threat hunting is getting a lot of, you know, a lot of airways of late. Certainly over probably the last 18 months, there's been a lot around this threat hunting and a lot of commercialization around it. So I would just like to simplify it to say that, you know, think about threat hunting. It's the act of being proactive in search of not only existing but potential threats to the organization. So it's not new. Even though folks might, you know, claim that threat hunting is new, that's not the case. Like, I mean, threat hunting is effectively, you know, incident management in more of a proactive and maybe a more of a specific or focused manner that leverages much more data, has specialized teams that actually that's their job. And that's, you know, so that's kind of why it's a little bit different, but not. So if we jump to the next slide, Daryl. So where threat hunting kind of grew some legs in terms of being, buzzword or industry buzz was around its relationship to advanced persistent threats. And so, or APT for short, for those that are familiar with it, right? So as the words indicate, advanced persistent threats they're more sophisticated. And the intentions of APTs are to stay in the environment and be undetected. So unlike other threats to the organization where, kind of the smash and grab where hackers or disgruntled insiders may try to get some credit card information or get some client information, et cetera. And, they're just in and they're out and they don't care because they've accomplished their mission. Whereas this is quite different. This is where more sophistication is in place and very small amounts of information trickle out the organization for years potentially. And we've seen that. There are documented cases back to the early 2000s. So again, back almost 20 years around, in a large case, a lot of crime organizations or political states that have deployed software into some very specific organizations that have very interesting intellectual property and or they're looking for financial gain. So these are they're definitely harder to find. It's not to say it's a needle in the haystack, but in some regards it kind of is, only because their purpose is to remain undetected. So it's very stealthy and very complex. So if you don't have the capability to detect that needle in the haystack and respond to it in a fashion that is, that meets the needs of your organization, then you're doing yourself a disservice. So ultimately, threat hunting, think about that as just being more proactive. So when we think about threat hunting, there are some key capabilities that an organization requires. And the first one is around security practitioners with expertise. So I'll just touch on that one briefly, right? Is related to the security monitoring comments, where organizations, frankly, they just don't have the capital or the time frame to invest in, all the things that are happening in the security world as it relates to changing technology, acquisitions, mergers, companies that do a bunch of M&A, all of that. So rather than potentially trying to build it out, they will look to outsource it. So it being kind of security capabilities. And so this whole threat hunting capability where you need very specialized skill sets, you need somebody that can actually understand the company. And when we think about understanding the company, we're really talking at a level of data and understanding data and data that is moving around in the company and outside the company. And so that's no small task. So these other individuals, and I've mentioned data, so data is really important. So it's really important for companies to have historical information, because it's very difficult to determine anomalies within the environment if you have nothing to base that on. So for an organization to start from scratch, kind of greenfield, and say that we're going to do threat hunting with no data, they're kidding themselves, because they have nothing to actually go against to determine what's normal, what is the norm. So the data side is a really big part of this, and clearly, right, and going back to my earlier comments, this is not a security specific function or capability. This is a business and an IT extension, right? We all have to work together to make sure that we have the right data so that we can do the right level of monitoring to identify threats and ultimately assess risk to the organization. So the other thing I would mention is an individual or a team, just within their own understanding or education is not enough. So they need to be plugged into the latest threat intelligence. So think about threat intelligence, right, as being those organizations or those companies out there that are in the business of understanding the global threat, landscape. So there's a lot of free and or commercial products that are out there that can help you understand what's happening in the threat world. And that leads us to the last part, is the security operations side of it. I'm suggesting it does need to be 7 by 24 by 365. As we all probably know, right, is the security domain, it doesn't sleep. It's definitely not a 9 to 5 business. Those that are interested in doing stealthy things are going to try to hide during the day, but even more so, they're going to try to do some very small things after hours when nobody's looking potentially. And so that's kind of why, you know, a pretty robust security operations team is required to meet the need overall.
Thanks, Rick. And so I leave you with this question. How often do you feel like the other team, if you have more than one, just doesn't get what's really important? Whether you're in security or you're in operations, it kind of feels like sometimes there's this massive gap of being able to move things forward. If you don't have that clear view of how your applications are connected, if you're having a hard time getting applications and the moving the business forward because your release and change processes are delayed, or you're having outages because you don't understand, coming in and getting that discovery to get your current state should be a next step. If you don't know what vulnerabilities to work on next, or if you do know and you can't get an agreement from others in the organization, it can feel like this expanse is here. Or if you don't have automation where you think it should be, or would like it to be, or enough progress in moving forward, contact Rick or I, or anyone at online, and we'll definitely help. We'll come in and do a complimentary discovery session to determine what your next best set of actions. Put a plan together, whether it's starting right at the discover phase or putting together what getting to automation into your organization can look like. That's what we're good at. That's what we've done well. We're here to help. So to close off, we've seen a lot of changes in our clients as a result of COVID, most especially in the recent months, and some amazing turnarounds in some of them. Rick and I have seen converged security and operations teams become a foundation for advancing organizations move forward. And we've also seen the converse, where there's too much of a gap and they're getting in the way of being as responsive as they need to. So we know it's possible, and we've seen it firsthand. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for their time today and turn it over to Keegan.
Thank you very much, Daryl and Rick, for your presentation. We did have a couple of questions pop up while the presentation was in flight, so I'm going to start with those. If anybody has additional questions, though, please feel free to write something in either the chat or the question box. Or as Daryl said, if you would like to ask something, you know, yourself in person, up on the screen right now is Daryl and Rick's email and phone number information. Please feel free to reach out to them once the presentation is concluded. So we will start with the first question. So the first one is, can you comment on what you're seeing with clients in terms of common areas of challenge?
Daryl, maybe I can start with that one.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Rick.
So, you know, from the security side, actually we highlighted it a little bit earlier in the presentation, but I would suggest that there's probably 4 areas that for sure are common across, regardless of size of organization, regardless of industry. The first one is around asset management. Understanding your business in terms of inventorying software and hardware. The second thing that I probably would touch on is kind of from the secure configuration side of it. While it's best practice around, you know, locking down and hardening and all of that, I think that most organizations are okay with certain technologies, but broadly speaking, across all of their infrastructure, I think it's a common challenge. The fourth one would for sure be around what to do with vulnerabilities. So, like, I mean, Daryl mentioned it, I've seen it. I've worked with clients where it is not uncommon for them to have tens of thousands of vulnerabilities within their organization. And honestly, thousands of those that are critical that could actually be exploited. So, you know, I probably would echo where Daryl was headed, that organizations today that have kind of diverse, I'll say emerging as well as traditional legacy IT, and along with traditional legacy IT, I don't think, frankly, you have a choice to not go towards more of an automated vulnerability management program. So those are my perspectives.
And, I'll add just one point. What I've seen is that many organizations believe they have a really good handle on their assets because they're correlating that to whether they're able to have sustainable production environments. And so when they start making changes and applying patches and moving, they have gaps, they have blind spots in their asset view, and it just slows them down and it gets in the way, and then they can become even more paralyzed. So even if you think you do have a good first step, understanding your current state, getting a second opinion and finding those missed assets and those blind spots is we've seen that time and again where organizations have a better starting point when they start from step one.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, and thank you for the question. So the second one that came through during the presentation, and forgive me, I might stumble over my words here. This is a long one. What is the approximate time frame for establishing a pseudo-automated vulnerability management strategy and operations for a mid-sized company?
Let me take that one, Rick. So, of course, the answer is always it depends. And that depends is on the maturity within any organization. But typically, we see it take about 4 to 6 months to be able to understand their assets, start from scratch, really figure out what assets and applications are important, and then migrate up through the prioritization of the vulnerabilities and configurations that are most important, and then start getting into the automation and being able to connect to those server environments with the tool sets to create the automation, automate the approvals, automate the implementation of the patches, automate when during maintenance windows, and automate the rollback. And so that's an iterative approach and process that's necessary to be able to trust in automation. If we can't get it done manually, how can we trust that it's going to work through automation? And so we've had success when we take that iterative approach over a 4-month time frame and then be able to get it in about 6 months. So if you think that automation is where you need to be in 6 months, now is the time to start that process.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, and thank you again for the question. We are rounding up at the top of the hour, and it's looking like we do not have any further questions. So I think we can conclude the presentation at this time.
Well, thank you very much. Hopefully everyone got some use out of the discussion today. And by all means, please reach out to us if you have any further questions.
Yes, thanks everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.